Welcome back and welcome back. This video I'm doing about the 10 most violent inmates of all time. First off, in California prison, let's go.
Inmates across California's prison system stopped eating, all at once. Coordinated across dozens of facilities, spanning rival gangs that had spent decades trying to kill each other. And the man who organized the entire thing, who brokered alliances between sworn enemies and brought the largest state prison system in America to a standstill, did all of it from inside a concrete cell he hadn't left in over 20 years. What nobody knew at the time was that Todd Ashker had also been filing federal lawsuits from that same cell, and one of them was about to reshape solitary confinement in the United States forever. Ashker's early legal education started with a bullet. He entered the California prison system at 18 on a burglary conviction, and by 1987, he was shot in the wrist by a correctional officer during a failed escape attempt at New Folsom. The bullet stayed lodged in his arm, and the incident became the basis for an early civil rights case that went all the way to the Ninth Circuit. In Ashker versus California Department of Corrections, decided in 1997, the court established that prisoners had a right to access law library materials. It was the first time Ashker put his name on a case. It would not be the last. By 1990, Ashker had been convicted of second-degree murder for the stabbing death of fellow inmate Daniel Lee Reese during what he described as a prearranged fight. That conviction sent him to the Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit on May 2, 1990, where the California Department of Corrections intended him to stay permanently. They validated him as an Aryan Brotherhood associate in 1988, a designation Ashker has always denied, and under the gang validation policy of that era, a single label like that could lock a man in solitary for the rest of his natural life. There was no review process, no release date, no appeal that went anywhere. The only way out was debriefing, which meant providing intelligence on other inmates. In the prison system, debriefing was a death warrant written in your own handwriting. Once you were labeled a snitch, every yard in the state became a crime scene waiting to happen. So Ashker stayed in his cell for 25 years. The Pelican Bay SHU was not a prison within a prison. It was a sensory void. Inmates spent 22.5 hours a day in windowless concrete cells with a poured slab for a bed, a steel sink, and lighting that never fully shut off. The remaining 90 minutes were spent alone in an exercise pen barely larger than the cell. There were no phone calls, no communal meals, no yard time with other human beings. Presidents came and went. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet transformed the planet. Todd Ashker experienced none of it. His only contact with the outside world was mail, which was screened, redacted, and delayed by weeks. What he did during those decades is what separates his story from every other lifer in the SHU. He turned himself into a jailhouse lawyer so effective that his legal work would eventually dismantle the very system holding him. In 2009, he filed what would become Ashker versus Governor of California in the Northern District of California. The suit argued that locking human beings in windowless cells for decades, based solely on an alleged gang label, with no meaningful process for challenging the designation, amounted to cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The case was certified as a class action in 2014, meaning it no longer represented just Todd Ashker. It represented every inmate in the SHU system subjected to the same conditions. But the case that caught the world's attention was not the lawsuit. It was the hunger strikes. In July of 2011, inmates across multiple California prisons refused food for weeks. A second wave followed that September. Then on July 8th, 2013, the strike that changed everything began. It lasted nearly 60 days and involved an estimated 30,000 participants at its peak, according to CDCR figures, making it the largest prison hunger strike in American history. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. To organize a statewide action of that scale, Oshker had to accomplish something that prison officials had spent decades trying to prevent. He brokered an alliance, not between friends or allies, but between the four most violent prison gangs in California: the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia. These organizations had been murdering each other's members on the same yards and tiers for generations. Their racial politics, territorial disputes, and blood debts ran so deep that even sharing a meal would have been considered a betrayal a few years earlier. Oshker convinced all four to coordinate, from inside cells where none of them could see or touch each other. He told supporters on the outside that a core group of them were committed to taking the strike all the way to death if necessary. His attorney, Ann Wiles, told reporters that if Oshker had been released into the business world, he would have risen to the top very quickly, describing him as extraordinarily brave and willing to accept enormous risk. And according to Oshker, corrections officials told him directly in 2004 that he was considered a terrorist, and that he would remain in the SHU until he agreed to fully cooperate with authorities in dismantling the gangs. On September 1st, 2015, the lawsuit settled. California agreed to end indefinite gang-based SHU placements. Inmates would be reviewed under a new step-down program, and gang validation alone would no longer justify permanent isolation. The SHU population at Pelican Bay dropped from 1,102 in September of 2015 to 476 by October of 2017. Men who had entered solitary during the first Bush administration walked onto general population yards during the Trump administration. Legal scholars called it the most significant solitary confinement reform in United States history, and every word of the original complaint had been drafted by a man who taught himself the law from an 8x10 concrete box. And somehow, it gets worse. Oshker was moved to Kern Valley State Prison after the settlement, but by 2017, reporters at The Nation and Solitary Watch documented that CDCR had already found workarounds to the consent decree, cycling Oshker back into administrative segregation under different bureaucratic justifications. The man who literally rewrote the rules of isolation in California was placed right back into a version of the same box. As of the latest reports, Todd Oshker remains alive and in custody. But Oshker's case was about policy. The man in the neighboring cell block had been locked in solitary even longer, and his story ends not with a settlement, but with a stabbing in broad daylight. Hugo Pinnell. For 24 consecutive years, Hugo Pinnell lived inside the Pelican Bay SHU, making him the longest-serving inmate in California isolation at the time. He survived the San Quentin Uprising of 1971, survived a 16-month trial that became one of the longest in California history, and survived decade after decade in a concrete cell with no natural light. That was August 2015. By September, he was dead, stabbed to death in an exercise yard within weeks of being released into general population. Pinnell was born on March 10, 1945 in Nicaragua. He entered the California prison system at 19 after pleading guilty to assault and kidnapping charges in San Francisco. A plea he maintained for the rest of his life was coerced under the threat of the death penalty. Once inside, he became a close associate of George Jackson and W.L. Nolan, central figures in the radical prison movement, sweeping through California in the late 60s. CDCR identified Pinnell as a member of the Black Guerrilla family, though Pinnell denied formal membership for decades. Then came 1971, the year that turned Pinnell from an inmate into a permanent fixture of California's most violent history. That January, he stabbed Correctional Officer Roy J. McCarthy to death at the Soledad Correctional Training Facility. 7 months later, on August 21st, the San Quentin Adjustment Center erupted. George Jackson attempted to escape. A firearm made it onto the tier. By the time it was over, 3 correctional officers, Frank DeLeon, Paul Crescenez, and Jerry Graham, were dead, along with 2 inmates, John Lynn and Ronald Kane. It was one of the bloodiest days in the history of the California prison system. Pinnell was charged as one of the San Quentin Six, the group of inmates prosecuted together for the uprising. The trial lasted 16 months and descended into chaos that made national news. Defendants were at points shackled to their chairs and gagged in the courtroom after outbursts that interrupted testimony. Security for the proceedings was unprecedented. The case became a symbol of the radicalized prison movement sweeping through California, and Pinnell, already convicted of killing 1 correctional officer and connected to one of the deadliest prison events in the state's history, sat at the center of it. At the end of it, the jury convicted Pinnell of 2 counts of assault on a guard for slashing the throats of correctional officers Urbano Rubiaco Jr. and Charles Breckenridge. Both officers survived. On the murder charges, Pinnell was acquitted. That's not a typo, by the way. He was cleared of the killings, convicted of the throat slashings, and the time he had already accumulated ensured he would never see the outside world again regardless. Pinnell was transferred to the Pelican Bay SHU in 1990. For the next 24 years, he existed in conditions designed to reduce a human being to a schedule. 22.5 hours a day in a windowless cell. 90 minutes in a solitary exercise pen. No communal meals. No yard time with other inmates. No physical contact during visits. His world was concrete, fluorescent light and silence. Through all of it, Pinnell continued to file for parole. The board denied him 10 separate times, with the final denial on May 2nd, 2014. Each hearing ended the same way. The nature of his crimes, the violence of the San Quentin uprising, and the officer he had killed at Soledad followed him into every room. He participated in the 2013 hunger strike alongside Ashker and others from the short corridor. In January of 2014, as part of the broader population shifts triggered by the Ashker litigation, he was moved to California State Prison in Sacramento, also called New Folsom. After spending more than 2 decades in a box, Pinnell was being placed into a general population facility. For a man with his reputation and his history, that transfer carried a weight that should have been obvious to everyone involved. In 3 years, Pinnell would understand exactly what that transfer meant. On August 12, 2015, Pinnell, now 71 years old, stepped into the New Folsom exercise yard. He had not been on an open yard surrounded by other inmates in a quarter century. The exposure was total. Within minutes, 2 Aryan Brotherhood inmates attacked and stabbed him to death. The killing was not a random act of yard violence. It was planned, sanctioned, and rewarded. The attack triggered a riot that injured 11 other prisoners across the facility. His attorney, Keith Whatley, told the Associated Press afterward that Pinnell had been a target from virtually every group in prison because of his notoriety and what he had done decades earlier, and that the attack was entirely foreseeable, which is what made it so much worse. The prison system knew his history. They knew the standing threats against him. They knew that the Aryan Brotherhood, the very organization whose members would kill him, had operated hit lists inside California prisons for years. They placed him in the general population anyway. The two men who killed Pinnell were later identified through the federal Aryan Brotherhood prosecution that concluded in 2024. They earned AB patches for the murder, the gang's formal recognition for a sanctioned killing. The man who ordered the hit, Ronald Yandel, was convicted in April of 2024 of murder in aid of racketeering for Pinnell's death. Yandel will appear later in this video. Hugo Pinnell survived the San Quentin uprising, survived 24 years of solitary confinement, and was denied parole 10 times by a system that never intended to let him go. He lasted weeks in an open yard. 24 years of isolation kept him alive. The moment it ended, so did he. René Enriquez. The Mexican Mafia has a rule about membership that is not negotiable. You are in for life, or your life ends because you tried to leave. There is no resignation, no inactive status, no quiet retirement. The standing order on anyone who drops out is execution on sight, and that order does not expire. In 2002, René Enriquez, a maid carnal of the Mexican Mafia, who had ordered contract killings and run extortion networks across East Los Angeles, walked away from the organization and offered himself to the federal government as a cooperating witness. Then, on a day most people in the system assumed would never come, he survived long enough to be approved for parole over 20 years later. Whether that makes him a changed man or a killer who found a better arrangement is the question his story never quite answers. If you had asked anyone in Artesia, California about Enriquez in the late 1970s, they would have told you he was a kid from the neighborhood, already deep in the life. He was initiated into the Artesia 13 Street Gang around age 12 and convicted of armed robbery as a juvenile. By 1985, while already incarcerated, he was inducted as a full member of the Mexican Mafia, not an associate or a hanger-on, but a carnal with authority over operations and the power to order violence. The crimes he committed after that induction were calculated and personal. After a 1989 parole, Enriquez ordered the killing of Cynthia Gavaldan, a woman he claimed had been withholding drug taxes from the organization. He also participated in the murder of fellow EME member David Gallegos, whom he and an accomplice force overdosed on heroin and then shot. That killing earned him a life sentence. On July 16, 1991, Enriquez and an associate named Benjamin Peters walked into a Los Angeles County Jail interview room. A room with cameras, a room with guards stationed right outside, and stabbed EME leader Salvador Buenrostro 26 times. Buenrostro survived. The brazenness of the attack was the point. In the Mexican Mafia, violence that was open was not a failure of planning. It was a message. Enriquez spent roughly 10 years in the Pelican Bay SHU, and even from inside that isolation unit, with no phone, no internet, and no physical contact with anyone beyond a slot in a steel door, he continued running street operations across East Los Angeles. He used coded letters smuggled into approved correspondence and relay networks routed through visitors who would memorize instructions and deliver them to contacts on the outside. The SHU was supposed to sever men like Enriquez from their power. He treated it like a remote office. Journalist Sam Quinones and author Chris Blatchford, who wrote The Black Hand in 2008, documented these operations extensively. Enriquez once said of himself that he believed he was a cut above the rest, and that being a mafioso required a certain elitism. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Now Enriquez could have stayed there, running operations from his cell until he died. He didn't. 2002, he dropped out of the Mexican Mafia and entered CDCR's Sensitive Needs Yard system, protective custody for inmates who have cooperated or face threats from former affiliations. Dropping out of EME is not like quitting a job. The standing order inside the organization is that dropouts are to be killed on sight, and Enriquez knew the rule better than anyone, because he had been one of the men enforcing it for years. Over the next 2 decades, he provided intelligence and testimony in dozens of state murder trials and federal racketeering cases. By 2014, officials from at least 11 federal and state agencies had written letters to the parole board supporting his release. It made no difference. Governor Jerry Brown blocked his parole in February of 2015 and again in November of 2017, stating that as a high-profile dropout targeted by the Mexican Mafia, Enriquez's release would pose a serious security threat to himself, his family, his parole agents, and the broader community. Brown also commented that Enriquez presented what he described as a rather shallow understanding of how he came to commit so many violent crimes. Pay attention to that detail, because it explains everything about what happened next. Governor Gavin Newsom denied parole again in April of 2019, citing unique security threats. But in a later 2023 hearing, Newsom turned the decision over to a 12-member parole board panel, which approved Enriquez for release into what would likely become a witness protection arrangement. The decision has remained contested. The Gavaldon family has continued to object, disputing Enriquez's depiction of Cynthia Gavaldon as a drug dealer. For them, no amount of cooperation with the government undoes the fact that he ordered her death. As of 2026, Rene Enriquez remains in protective custody. His testimony helped dismantle operations that had run unchecked for decades, and his parole battle has now outlasted 2 California governors. The Mexican Mafia's standing execution order on his life has never been rescinded. The same organization that wanted Enriquez dead owed much of its early power to a man who, by every measure of ethnicity, should never have been allowed through the door. He was not Mexican, not Hispanic, and he had one leg. And he became one of the most feared members they ever had. Joseph Morgan. Sometime around 1971, a white man of Croatian descent with a prosthetic leg was formally inducted into the Mexican Mafia as a full carnal. Not as an associate kept at a safe distance, not as a business partner tolerated because he was useful. A fully made member with the same authority, the same standing, and the same obligations as every other man at the table. His name was Joseph Morgan, and he remains the only non-Hispanic ever granted that status in the history of the organization. But the Mexican Mafia does not hand out memberships for sentimental reasons. Morgan earned his seat the same way everyone else did, through violence so consistent and so reliable that the organization could not afford to keep him on the outside. Morgan was born on April 10, 1929, in the San Pedro neighborhood of East Los Angeles to Croatian immigrants. His family name was Megjugorak before his father had it anglicized. He joined the Maravilla street gang in the late 1930s, when he was still a child growing up on those blocks. And by the time he was 17, he had already committed murder. He beat the husband of his 32-year-old girlfriend to death with a tire iron and buried the body in the Malibu hills. Convicted of second-degree murder in 1946, he was sentenced to 9 years at San Quentin. He paroled in 1955. Within a year, he was back inside after pulling a machine gun bank robbery in West Covina that netted $17,000. During the job, according to accounts from former gang investigator Richard Valdemar, and later from Rene Enriquez himself, Morgan was shot in the leg. The injury eventually cost him the limb, and from that point forward, he carried the name Pegleg. A federal arms trafficking conviction added roughly 7 months on top of his state time. When he returned to the California system after that, he was no longer a street-level bank robber. He was building something bigger. Morgan's induction into the Mexican Mafia around 1971 or 1972 was not ceremonial. That same year, he carried out what is considered the first EME-ordered street execution in Los Angeles, shooting fellow member Alfonso Alvarez twice in the head in Monterey Park, because Alvarez had been skimming drug taxes from the organization, one of their own executed in public for stealing money. The message to every other member and associate in the system was absolute. Morgan then went on to cement the Mexican Mafia's narcotics pipeline with suppliers in Mexico, negotiate the loose working alliance between EME and the Aryan Brotherhood against the Black Guerrilla family, and run the organization's operations from inside San Quentin, Folsom, and eventually Pelican Bay. A one-legged Croatian immigrant, running the backbone of one of the most feared prison gangs in the country, from a series of maximum security cells. And no, I'm not making that up. Morgan's reach extended into Hollywood, whether Hollywood wanted it or not. When Edward James Olmos released American Me in 1992, a film depicting a fictionalized version of the Mexican Mafia's rise, Morgan sued Olmos, Universal, and the producers for $500,000, claiming the character played by William Forsythe had been based on him without consent. The lawsuit was one thing, the murders were another. American Me was also reportedly connected to the killings of at least 2 of its consultants, people who had provided insider knowledge about EME to the production. Those murders have never been prosecuted. The character Miklo Velka in Blood In, Blood Out, released in 1993, is also loosely modeled on Morgan's life. 2 major studio films drew on one man's story, and both left bodies behind. Morgan's attorney, Shirley MacDonald, visited him about 6 months before he died, and later recalled that he appeared to be losing weight, and his color was not good, but that Joe was a very private man and never complained about anything. On November 9, 1993, Joseph Morgan died of inoperable liver cancer at California State Prison in Corcoran after being transferred from Pelican Bay. He was 64 years old. The cancer had been diagnosed only 13 days earlier, on October 27th. 13 days from diagnosis to death. The disease had been growing inside him for months, possibly much longer, and Morgan either did not know or refused to acknowledge it. He was not the kind of man who asked for help, and the prison medical system of the early 90s was not the kind of system that went looking for problems in aging lifers. He had entered the California prison system at 17 years old and died inside it 47 years later, having spent his entire adult life behind walls. He never debriefed. He never cooperated with any agency. He never provided a single piece of intelligence against the organization he had helped build. That silence, more than the violence, more than the bank robberies, more than the Hollywood lawsuits, is what earned him a level of respect inside the system that outlived him by decades. In a world where cooperation was currency and betrayal was a survival strategy, Morgan refused to spend a single word. Up to this point, every inmate on this list operated within the California state prison system. The next man turned a prison gang into something that operated across the entire federal system, and the way he communicated his orders would become one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence ever presented in a federal courtroom. Barry Byron Mills. How does a man convicted of robbing a convenience store in 1969 end up running a criminal organization with an estimated 15 to 20,000 members from inside the most secure prison in the United States? Barry Mills managed it, and he did it without ever setting foot outside of a federal facility after his mid-20s. By the time a jury in Santa Ana deliberated his fate in 2006, prosecutors had connected his name to roughly 30 murders and attempted murders. 9 of the 12 jurors voted to execute him. The other 3 voted for life. Because the decision required unanimity, the judge declared a penalty phase mistrial, and Barry Mills received 4 life sentences instead. 3 votes. That was the distance between a lethal injection and a quiet death on his own schedule. Mills was born on July 7, 1948, in Windsor, California. He entered the state system in 1969 on the convenience store robbery charge and joined the Aryan Brotherhood at San Quentin, back when the AB was a small prison protection clique, concentrated in a handful of California and federal facilities, with no meaningful presence outside prison walls. Mills changed that. By 1979, he had nearly beheaded an inmate named John Marsloff in a bathroom at United States Penitentiary, Atlanta, over a gambling debt, earning an additional life sentence and the kind of reputation that moved through the federal system faster than any transfer bus. Around 1980, he was elevated to the AB's 3-member federal commission, the governing body of the organization. From that seat, he spent the next 2 decades transforming the Aryan Brotherhood from a loose gang of 50 or 60 members into a nationwide criminal syndicate with thousands of associates on the streets running drug operations, contract killings, and extortion networks. In one generation, one man, locked inside a federal cell, built all of that. The murders that brought Mills to trial in 2006 were spread across years and across facilities, and they followed a pattern prosecutors described as methodical. Arva Lee Ray was killed at Federal Correctional Institution Lompoc in 1989. Frank Joyner and Abdul Salam, both members of the DC Blacks Gang, were killed at United States Penitentiary Lewisburg in 1997 as part of a coordinated race war that Mills launched from his cell. The method of communication was what made the case unforgettable. Mills transmitted his kill orders through coded messages reportedly written in his own urine and smuggled tier to tier inside the prison. The idea that a man could start a war between gangs using nothing but coded language and biological fluid sounds like something invented for a film. It was documented federal evidence presented in open court. The trial before Judge David O. Carter lasted 4 months and laid out a scope of violence that was staggering even by federal racketeering standards. Prosecutors detailed roughly 30 murders and attempted murders tied